Looks like the upload is working. Let me pop open Twitch on my phone here. Probably gonna have to watch an ad. Okay, I think I'm online. Gonna pass the link in here. I thought I was live in Twitch. Oh, there we go. Can you see me? I see someone in the chat room. It says I'm streaming. Oh, okay. All right. Well, on my phone, it doesn't show that I'm connected yet. That's really weird. How does the audio sound? I'm using the microphone that is of questionable quality right now. Audio sounds good. Okay, cool. Thank you. All right, so tonight we are already in week 13, which is crazy to think about. We are going to be focusing pretty much for the rest of the semester on getting our projects put together. This week there is a little bit of JavaScript to work on. Really, the major assignment of the week I would have to say is the wireframes project. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about that because I had some requests from students to mention that. So within Moodle, there is a wireframe scavenger hunt. And the idea behind this is I think every person that's ever made a wireframe before makes them in a different style from everyone else. And honestly, if you had another instructor for this class, they might wireframe differently than I do. I think that the gist of wireframing is just to get the ideas out of your head and onto paper, and that paper can be digital. So I actually used to wireframe when I was the design editor for my college newspaper. And I posted an example, and I tell you that it's rough and potentially a little bit embarrassing because it's a little squiggle. I had a little 12 by 12 whiteboard, just a square whiteboard, and actually I still have it on my desk at work today. And I will take that with a whiteboard marker and draw out nothing that's really legible word-wise, but I'll use X's to represent big headlines, and I'll use lines to represent columns of text. So what you're seeing on the screen is actually a recreation, a reimagining of what my wireframe sketches used to look like. And so the scenario that I employed wireframes for was really when we were planning out what to do with large imagery and the number of stories that we would put on like our front page or the back page or the center spread. And you can see the lines of text. We had a 12 column grid, and we would vary up the designs by saying that 2 of the columns will be here, 4 of the columns will be here, and that will represent one story. You can see that there's one story here that's dominant, it has the big photo, and then has the big heading underneath of it. Those same concepts I still use when I'm sketching out what a web page could look like. Now, a lot of web pages that you build on a site are going to look similar, so it might be wise for you to wireframe out where the navigation goes and have that be the same on every web page. Other than that, there's probably pieces of a web page that are going to be unique from each other. So what does your front page look like versus what a form looks like? You might be able to sketch out where the form like text input boxes go, where the buttons are, where thumbnails are versus larger versions of photos. So that's really the goal of wireframing. There's really no wrong way to make a wireframe. Someone made a joke in Slack about using paint, and maybe it's not really a joke. Maybe they really are going to use paint. That is totally fine by me. As part of the scavenger hunt, I want you to search the internet. You can use the Google image search. You can use Google itself. Search for wireframes to kind of get an idea for what that could look like. There are some people that actually want really detailed wireframes before they start building their web page. I'm not like that. I will actually make a couple sketches of what I think a web page could look like, and then I'll sketch out a few of them together. For your final project, I need to see 3 wireframes. And for this assignment, actually, let me open up the right tab. For this assignment, the final project wireframes, I do want those to be wireframes of 3 different web pages. And the reason that is significant is I want you to make the wireframes this week, and then when we get back next week after Thanksgiving, I want you to actually start making the rough draft of the website. So I want you to be able to go from the wireframes to figuring out what divs you need so you can start building your HTML and CSS. Back to the scavenger hunt. Oops. So for the scavenger hunt, I want you to search the internet for examples. And you could post them inside of Moodle just like this. Find an image, maybe take a picture of the screen, a screenshot of the screen, or download the image and put it inside of our scavenger hunt. Or I know that some students have already been sharing links to sample wireframes, and that's fine by me too. If you find a tool that makes it really easy to create a wireframe, feel free to share it here, and that can count towards your scavenger hunt contribution. Okay, I'm just checking the chat room. Looks like everyone's been able to get in so far. Are there any other questions about wireframes? I'm going to take a sip of my tea because it's cold in this office now. A student made a note that they did it backwards. Yeah, if you start building your final project already and you make the sketches after the fact, that's not exactly in the spirit of what we're doing here. I'm trying to structure it so that you're kind of scaffolding. You're coming up with the proposal and the idea, finding the content, sketching out what it could look like, and then you'll be making some drafts. So if you've already started building, you're kind of skipping around the steps, but I'm sure it'll work out too. Any other questions about the wireframe scavenger hunt or the wireframes for your project? Okay, well, the star of tonight is JavaScript. And inside of Moodle, I have linked to quite a long course on jQuery. If you watch the beginning of that Linda course, or if you read the chapter in our textbook, you'll see that at least in the past, and still it's kind of true to this day, there were some challenges in trying to write JavaScript that worked in all browsers. So a long time ago, someone created a JavaScript library called jQuery that has revolutionized and made it much easier to write JavaScript that works in all the browsers, from mobile to desktop, from Safari to Internet Explorer. And I think it's important in this web design class, when I expose you to JavaScript, to expose you to something that you can be productive in very quickly. So I have linked to this longlynda.com course. I asked that you watch the first chapter, the first part of it, before today, because it introduces some of the concepts that I need to show you in tonight's live stream. You can watch the rest of that video series over the rest of the semester, and that would actually help you when it comes time to adding JavaScript to your final project. I think that the examples in that lynda.com course are really helpful. So I encourage you to watch that to completion on your own time. Tonight, I am going to demonstrate just one small example of how we added interactivity to the Mid-Michigan College website. And if you like this concept, you can apply it to your own project. You can actually build your own hide-a-box and put it on your site. Or you can take parts of what I'm going to show you tonight and reapply those concepts to make something entirely different. What I'm going to show you tonight is the basis of very simple animations, responding to user input, responding to events, and changing aspects of the web page. So like I said, this is either something you can use a lot of the code from or none of the code from when it comes time to building your final project. So what are we building? Well, I've opened up the Mid-Michigan College website, particularly the financial aid page. And if you go to the types of aid, we have a long list of all the types of aid we offer students that come here. And if this was all open by default, you'd have to scroll past all of the grant information before you got down to the veteran educational benefits. And if we decided maybe to make these links to other pages, you might not have a lot of content. For instance, the grants page really isn't that big. It's a paragraph, a button, and a video. We wanted to make it really simple for you to see a list of all the options, pop it open, read a little bit, and if it's not for you, close it while you're still on the financial aid page. So this is what we call a hide-a-box. We have them sprinkled throughout the mid website, and there's even some of these built into some Moodle courses. The idea is we have a secret or information that we don't want shown at first, but when you click on what we're going to call the toggle button, we want more information to show up on the page. So I have already provided the code for this, and I provided it in 2 versions. I provided a starter file that you can click on and download, and that will have the HTML and just a little bit of CSS from the mid website, and then it has a place where you can start writing the JavaScript. But the JavaScript is not written yet. We will look at that starter in just a second. And I also posted the final. The final will be very helpful if you want to start taking some of that code and applying it to your own project. And then tonight I'm doing something a little bit different. I have decided that I had you use CodePen in your group presentations, and I thought that this might be a good candidate for me to show you CodePen working with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript working all at once. So we're going to bounce around between all of these. I, of course, if you look at my desktop, I also have I've downloaded week 13 hide-a-box files onto my computer, and I have even opened those up inside of Atom. So if I open up the side here, you'll see that I have both the starter and the final hide-a-box opened up in Atom. And I'm probably going to bounce around between a couple of these throughout the live stream tonight. So let's open up the starter file, and let's open it up in Chrome. So I double-clicked on the HTML file, the starter file, and this is what that web page looks like. Not very fancy, and in fact, you'll see that clicking these links, nothing happens, and the message that would normally be hidden is already visible. So this is the web page without any JavaScript on here whatsoever. Now there are some interesting things on here. There are these little icons. I'm going to call them chevrons. It wasn't until a couple years ago that I learned what that symbol was called. They're called chevrons. I'm going to show you how those icons were added. And I have, let's see. I wanted to point out that when you open up the final, those icons change when you click on the hide-a-box link, the toggle button. So the ultimate goal here that we're going to try to complete by the end of this live stream is we want the page, when it loads, to hide what I'm going to call the secret. And the way that we reveal the secret is to click on the toggle button. And when you click the toggle button, we want another side effect to happen. We want the chevron to flip directions. We want it to go from pointing down, which signifies that there's content, to pointing up, which means that you have expanded the content and you can click on it to shrink it back upward. So how are we going to do this? Well, I'm going to pop over to the CodePen. And let's take a look at the HTML that I'm using. Now remember, when you create a CodePen, and I will share the link to the CodePen after the live stream, you don't need to put the starting HTML file or HTML tags in. CodePen is going to do that for you, so you can just start with the content that would go in the body. That makes it a little bit easier for me to show you this example, honestly, which is pretty cool. And you can also then have CSS that gets inserted automatically into the page. You don't have to add a style tag. You don't have to include a link tag. Any CSS that you write in here is going to be added to your page automatically. And then there's that third pane that we had never used before that we're going to use today. We're going to use the JavaScript pane. So this is all the code that we're going to walk through in a little bit. And what I've done inside of the JavaScript code is I've added a comment that indicates where I took the sample hide-a-box from, and it covers the goals of what we're trying to do tonight. So we already talked about this. One, we're going to hide that secret as soon as the page loads, and we're going to make the secret visible when you click on the toggle, like you can see over here in the preview. Gosh, I love how CodePen can let me put these side by side. And you got my video in here too, which is nice. And then third, we're going to flip that chevron whenever you click on the toggle button. So when you click on the toggle, we want the secret to show up and the icon to flip upside down. So how are we going to do this? Well, if you've read through the JavaScript chapters, we're going to be manipulating the DOM. If you think back to the web inspector activity, when we talked about the DOM, the document object model, we talked about how that was a representation of all the tags on your web page and about how the tags are related together. So when you open tags like divs or paragraphs, you are putting content inside of it and nesting them deeply. That establishes a relationship where a div might have a parent, which could be the body tag, and a div could also have a child, like in this case, the H2 that says grants. So the concepts that we're going to use tonight are actually searching and finding specific DOM elements with jQuery, and we can actually use some CSS to help us with that. And we're going to be walking up and down the DOM tree. Once we've selected a node, we need to be able to get to its parent or to find the closest parent to it. And then we're actually going to manipulate the DOM. So if you read chapter 22 already, it talks about creating new nodes and deleting nodes and doing things like that. We're not going to create or delete. We're just going to do something very simple. We're going to modify some attributes. We're going to change the classes associated with a div tag, and we are going to modify the visibility as well, which is essentially like changing the display CSS property. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. In order to do this, we actually have to register event handlers. So the main event handler that we're going to work with is click, because you're going to be clicking on things and we want actions to happen. And then we want to actually trigger event handlers. I wrote this first goal in a very specific way. I said that we want to hide the secret when the page loads. So we're actually going to be triggering one of the event handlers upon page load to hide all of the secrets. So that's an outline of what we're going to do today. Now, this CodePen already has the code in here working. I am just going to delete that right now. Pretend that it is gone so that we're back to the broken example where nothing happens when we click on these links. So let's review the HTML involved here. So at the top of the page we have the hide-a-box examples in an H1 and the paragraph from me that wishes us luck. Then I have two different divs, and I'm going to minimize them here. Both of these are divs with a class of hide-a-box. So from the code, you can see that we have two hide-a-boxes, and that makes sense because over on the right we have grants, and if my picture wasn't in the way, you would see isn't it cool, or isn't this cool right there. We have two hide-a-boxes, and the way that we designed this is we wanted to be able to have as many hide-a-boxes as we wanted on the page. Like when we're done with this, if we wanted to have a third one, we could paste it in here and change it to say something else, like third hide-a-box. This is a secret. So now in my HTML I have three hide-a-boxes, and now you'll see that I have a third one showing up. Let me go to browser only. A third one showing up right underneath the second one. That's a design goal. We want to be able to put as many of these on a page as we can. Now, when you think about as many, more than one, I hope you're thinking about classes. That's why I've gone with a class of hide-a-box instead of an ID of hide-a-box. If I had used ID, I could have only had one of these on a page, and that would be kind of a bummer. So that's why I have adopted classes. Now, what's inside of a hide-a-box? Well, there's two main parts. Let me collapse them here. So there is something that we're going to call the toggle button and something we're going to call the secret. You could have a lot of other content inside of this hide-a-box, but the two things that I am going to write code for that we need to have present is anything with a class of anything with a class of toggle button, and that could be an H2 like it is here, or it could be a different tag. In fact, I was goofing around earlier and wondering what it would be like if this was a button instead of an H2. So over here you'll see that we now have a little button that's showing up here, and so you could have just as easily have created a button that hides and shows content. But we'll go back to the financial aid example that uses an H2. And then secret. Now this class of secret this could be any sort of tag. So this could be a span, it could be a table, it could be a form, it could be a form field, anything that you want to hide and show. As long as you put the class of secret on it, that is going to be the content that we're going to write code to hide. So now that I've explained those two pieces of it, what's inside of the H2? Well, the H2 does contain a little bit of special content. It includes this anchor tag link that really goes nowhere because it doesn't need to go to a different part of the page. And then it includes this I tag, which you may have read about a long time ago as meaning italics. There is a beautiful beautiful font icon library called Font Awesome. And if I just Google for Font Awesome here, I'll pull it up. There is a free version of Font Awesome that you can adopt, and they will give you hundreds, if not thousands, of icons that you can use on your website. Anything from mail icons to rocket ships. I am using it for the chevrons. And the way that it works is once you have the JavaScript on the web page, you can just use these I tags and specify a couple special classes for Font Awesome and say which icon you want to appear. So this I tag is actually getting replaced with an icon over here. So that's what's inside of my toggle button: an anchor tag, an icon, and the word grants. What's inside the secret? Well, really anything can go in here. It can be, in this case, it's one single paragraph, but you might have a whole section of content, a whole table, a whole form. Like I said, you can put anything you want inside of here as long as it's in something with a class of secret. So those are the two examples. You'll see that the HTML is very similar in between them. I think it's time for us to start looking at, let's start with the CSS next. There's really not a lot to the CSS. I write a selector, a descendant selector, that will change the cursor to a pointer when I hover over this whole thing. Now, if I had just done the anchor tag, I might have just gotten like the word grants, but I actually wanted to write a class that will grab the whole toggle button and make sure that when my mouse is over it, even if it's over here on the right hand side, it will turn into a pointer icon. And the only other thing that I do is I change the font size with a descendant selector for the Font Awesome icon, because by default these chevrons are just huge, they're massive. So I add a little font size property that shrinks them down, and I could shrink that down further to 0.5, but I feel like that's too tiny. So I just wrote this selector so that it would shrink it down a little bit. That's it for CSS. You could do a lot more if you wanted, but we kept it simple on the mid website because we didn't know how we were going to use these on various pages. So we've looked at the HTML, we've looked at the CSS. Time to look at JavaScript, everybody. So let's talk about the goals. We want to make the secret visible when you click on the toggle. And remember that I have some HTML that lets me find the toggles because there's a class on them called toggle button, and I have secret, a class of secret, that's the stuff that I want to hide. So let's write some JavaScript, and instead of doing that in CodePen, I'm going to take a quick diversion back into Chrome so we can use the web inspector. When we were doing the first week of JavaScript, I got a lot of questions about how to write JavaScript, because someone pointed out that it is very picky when it comes to space and white space. So I'm going to show you how you can write JavaScript more quickly and get immediate feedback. When you open up the web inspector, which if you need a refresher, you can right click on anything in Chrome and go to inspect. We had previously been using the Elements tab, which allowed us to inspect various parts of a web page to see the CSS and the HTML. If we go to console, we did use this in the web inspector activity to write some JavaScript, and we're going to write some more today. So let's just practice with something simple. The alert function in JavaScript, you can type alert, and if you wanted to actually alert a certain message, you put parentheses and quotation marks, double quotation marks in here, and you can actually write what you want to appear. So if I wanted hello world to pop up in a box, this is what I would write. So I'm going to hit enter, and you'll see that this alert box pops up. And some of the sample JavaScript code that you wrote in chapter 21 should have done something like this. Now, I heard from a few people that had been trying to write alert and they had a space afterwards, and I don't think that necessarily will work perfectly. So be careful of where you're writing, where you're putting spaces. I like to have my function calls start with parentheses around them, and then when you're trying to actually write a message that appears, a string has to be inside of quoted strings. So if I had just written hello world without the quotation marks, I would have gotten this syntax error. Now the cool thing about using the console is I got this feedback immediately. So this is where I'm going to write my first code that will help us find DOM elements on the page. Now, I just realized that there was something that I did not go over in CodePen. So in the starter file that I give you in Atom, At the very top, I have the link to a style sheet, which allows you to use those icons, those font awesome icons. But I also have a section at the bottom where you can write your JavaScript code. And the secret that I helped you out with is I actually provided the source attribute to download and install jQuery on the web page that you're working on. In CodePen, I don't have that in the HTML. Instead, underneath settings, I can actually go to CSS and add external style sheets. So I have already added Font Awesome. It's actually really easy to do. If you just click inside of CodePen and want to install something, you can just search for whatever you want with at least it was working with autocomplete. It's right up here in the search box. If you want to add something, you can just search for Font Awesome and click on 470, and that is how I added Font Awesome in. Now this is the URL essentially that's in your JavaScript or in your starter file that you downloaded from Moodle already. So that was the CSS. The JavaScript, I added a similar way. I just came in here and I searched for jQuery, and the latest version of jQuery that's available is 3.3.1. So that's what added it here. So I'm going to close. So that makes my CodePen exactly like what you probably have available inside of Atom. The version of JavaScript or jQuery is probably a little bit different, but any version of jQuery should work for what we're doing today. There's not much different between version 1 and version 3 right now for what we're going to be doing. All right, I got a message from a student that said that it was freezing or lagging. Is anyone else experiencing that? Yeah, this microphone has me worried. Okay, all right. Let's get back to it. All right, so I'm going to focus on the JavaScript in the web console here. The first thing that I'm going to focus on is the section that says clicking on the toggle. How do I know when something has happened on the toggle? Well, for the first thing that I need to do is attach some sort of behavior on this toggle that appears on the page. So what I want to show you is how you can search the DOM. And we did something like this back in the Web Inspector activity. I think we looked and we counted up how many links there were or how many divs there were on a page. And we're going to do something that's going to look very similar to that. jQuery, when you have it installed on the page, and I'm going to switch over to this because I have jQuery. You know, I have jQuery on this page, don't I? Yeah. jQuery allows you to access all of its functionality by using the $sign. It's kind of a shortcut that means send this to jQuery. So when you want to send something to jQuery, it's actually the $sign and then the parentheses. So whatever you put inside of the parentheses acts as a selector. So selectors, it's a very similar concept to CSS selectors. In fact, I'm going to write CSS inside of here. So just inside of some quotation marks in here, I am going to write a selector that searches the DOM for anything with a class of hide-a-box. And if I hit enter, notice how I wrote the period for class here. So anything with a class of hide-a-box, it returns two items. That's what the 2 means there. If I open up the details on here, I can actually hover over each one of the hide-a-boxes to see where it is on the page. So we wrote a jQuery selector that looks for anything with a class of hide-a-box. Now, what we actually want to find, though, are the toggles. Right? We want to add some code that runs on the click of the toggle button. So let's take that selector and turn it from just a simple class selector to a descendant selector. I can add a space in here and a period, and I'm going to find the toggle buttons. So what this is doing is this actually searching for all of the toggle buttons that exist underneath the hide-a-boxes. If I wanted to, I could have just written a selector that finds all the toggle buttons, and that would probably work. But on the mid website, we can't control where these classes appear, so we really only wanted to register activity or actions to happen on the toggle buttons if they were underneath a hide a box. So the way the code was written on the mid website, we used a very specific descendant selector. I am going to hit enter here, and I still found two things, but you'll see that it's slightly different what it returned. If I hover over one of these, you'll see now it just highlights the part that is that clickable toggle button on here. So this is the selector that we're going to use. And we want to make something happen on click. So let's bounce over to here. And I'm going to write my first JavaScript. And I think I can just copy and paste here. Yeah, I can copy that. I'm going to paste it in here. And we are going to ask jQuery to register an event for us. jQuery provides us a method called on. And inside of it, we can actually give it some information. So we need to pass two arguments to it. The first thing that we're sending it is click, because we're going to say we want to do something on click. And the second thing that we're going to send to it is some code that we want to run. In this first example, I am going to register some code that's just alert. You clicked me. And now I can't finish typing. All right. So I put in this alert that's going to run on click. Oh, you know what? That didn't work. I'm sorry. I forgot how this is work. You're supposed to pass it a function that is going to do some code. So inside of the function is where I'm going to put the code that says you clicked me. Chapter 21 and 22 kind of covered functions a little bit. It's just like a variable for code. You could give functions a name and refer to them here. We're going to use what's called an anonymous function or an inline function. We're just going to define what we want to happen inside of here. And I kind of, when I hit an opening curly brace, I like to make everything start on a new line. The only other thing that we need in here is a semicolon at the end, because this is all one line of code. So if all this worked correctly, when I click on a toggle button, it should pop up an alert that says you clicked me. So I'm going to click on isn't this cool? And yes, indeed, it registered a function that says you clicked me. And I could do that on any one of these. Now what I think is interesting is you notice how as soon as I clicked on one, they both turned purple as if I had visited them. That's because the browser actually tried to visit the web page. And what web page did it visit? Well, I think if you look at the anchor tag, we just put the pound sign, which means load the current page. So it basically refreshed the page when I clicked on the link. If you don't want to lose your visitor, you can actually tell this function to return false. So typically a function is going to return the last value that happened inside of it. In case of the alert, it wouldn't return anything, but it would allow the very next step to happen. And when you click on a link, it tries to change the page. So one thing that we're going to do in here, like we do in the mid website, is return false, which means don't continue on. Don't allow the web page to browse forward. So now if I click on the link, you'll see it just says you clicked me, but the hyperlinks stay blue because we haven't visited that web page. So that's a positive there. So we now have searched the DOM, and we have registered an event handler, and we've popped up an alert. So we're starting to get some of the concepts down, and we've started working on goal number 2 here. Let's leave those buttons wired up. There's another line of code that I want to run right here that is going to trigger an event handler, and it is going to hide the secrets. So we're going to use let's see here. I'm looking at my notes here. What's the next best thing to do? You know, let's stay inside of this function before we go further, because I don't want to leave it just alerting. Let's actually have it do something. What is the goal? We want, when you click the toggle, for the secret to become visible. But right now it's already visible, so the next best thing that we can actually have it do is have it hide the secret. And that is something that the final version of this does. If I go back to the the financial aid example, once it's open, when you click on it, it closes it again. So instead of working on making the secret appear, let's make the secret disappear first as a baseline. So instead of alerting, let's delete that code. And we want to make the secret disappear when I click it. So let's write another selector. Let's write a selector that finds the hide-a-box. And once we found it, let's actually call a function that's built into jQuery called toggle. It's one of my favorite functions inside of jQuery that you get for free. Toggle is a shortcut that will actually write some CSS. It actually will be the equivalent of changing display to none or display to block. So it'll actually go back and forth between display none and display block. So with this written, as soon as I click on this toggle button, you'll see that it hid the hide-a-box. Oh, in fact, that was probably the wrong way to go about it. We just want it to hide the secrets inside of the hide-a-box. So let's start with that again. So let's change our selector to be a descendant selector. We are going to click on the button, and now it hides and shows, well, it hides and shows all the secrets. So we've got the functionality that we want, but because we're using a jQuery selector, it is finding all of the hide-a-boxes and all of the secrets within the hide-a-boxes. So jQuery actually will let us be a bit more specific with what we're working on. Remember that we have this document object model, a tree, where we can walk up and down. So once we have a toggle button, we can actually look higher up and lower down for what we want to modify. And if we're looking at the HTML, when I click on the toggle button, I want to do something to the secret. Now, the secret is not within the toggle button. The secret is actually a child of secret. Or sorry, the secret is a child of toggle button. So it's almost like we're going to have to go up to the hide-a-box and then back down to the secret in order to do something with it. So what we're going to do in the JavaScript down here is start. We're going to leave this toggle, but what we're going to select is something different. We're going to start by selecting what we currently have. That's using the word this. So inside of this function, we are given some context. We are actually given the results of this selector. So we're on each one of the toggle buttons. We're inside of a function. We have access to the toggle button that we currently selected. So we're going to select this, and we're going to find the closest hide-a-box. So what this is going to do is look inside of the DOM and imagine it like a tree here. In fact, I can mimic that with this HTML here. When you click on a toggle button, we're going to find the closest hide-a-box in the DOM. The closest one is just by going up a level to hide-a-box. And then what we want to do is select the secret that's underneath that. So then we're going to find something with a class of secret underneath it. And that is what we're going to toggle. So by chaining together a few of the jQuery methods, what are the jQuery methods? Well, if you just Google search for jQuery, there is a page with lots and lots of documentation. If you go to the API documentation page, you look in here, you can search for find, and you can read all about the find method. The one that's more interesting to me is closest. So it says for each element in the set, get the first element that matches the selector by testing the element itself and traversing up its ancestors in the DOM tree. So this is a way of starting with itself, going up, looking for the closest version of it. So let's see what happens when I click on one of these toggle buttons. Hey, look at that. Just the one secret is shown or hidden. So does this equal what you click on is a question in the chat room. This is what you're clicking on because it is the action, or it is the element that has the click event happening. This section of code right here, this function, is being applied to every one of the hide-a-box toggle buttons though. So like if I'm clicking on this one down here, you'll see that what I'm affecting is the secret that's within this hide box. There's probably other ways to write this in jQuery as well. What we tried to do at Mid was make it just be as few lines of code and use as many of the jQuery helper functions as we could. And closest is really super powerful. The word "this" that does come from JavaScript. It is a concept in JavaScript. It's usually like the context of the function that you're in. All right, it sounds like that answered your question, I hope. So yeah, now we've got the hide box pretty much working, right? Well, we've got the secret becoming visible and hidden. Unfortunately, that chevron stays the same. So let's see if we can. I'm going to rearrange some of my code here. Toggle is the equivalent of changing display none or display block. Let's try to flip the chevron. So toggle is a really cool helper function. You just call toggle and it will make something invisible or make it visible. There's a similar function called toggle class, and what we want to do is find this font awesome icon that's in here and flip it around by changing the class. So we're going to use a very similar trick. We're going to find this, and if we look inside the DOM tree, remember we're on the toggle button because that's what was clicked. If I open up the toggle button, that's actually where the icon is, so I don't have to go up a level. I don't have to use closest, so I am actually just going to use the find directly here. And then the selector that we wrote was very specific. We wanted to find the font awesome icon, and what we found out is that there were some instances where a hide box contained other icons, so we didn't want to change all the icons. So we actually used first, which is a jQuery method that will pick the first element that it finds that has a class of font awesome that is the I tag, and then we use the toggle class method. And toggle class, if you look for it on the jQuery API web page, toggle class right here, toggle class. On this web page, they'll show you some examples of how to use it. Toggle class actually can take two parameters. You can have the class name that you want and the class name that you want to replace it with. So in our example, we want to take the FA chevron up and replace it with FA chevron down. So we passed both of those in inside of one string. And what's cool is when it's one state, it's going to flip it to the other and vice versa. So let's see if when I click, those icons change around. And now those are flipping around. That's cool. So everything is working well, except if I reload the page. Oh, and now I don't even know how to reload the page. Let me just hit refresh inside of CodePen here. When I reload the page, you'll notice that we're missing our first goal. The secret is visible still. Now what we found out, we could have, had CSS that hides the secret by default. What we found out is with Google indexing our website for search results, if the content wasn't visible, it wouldn't show up in the search results. So it's actually by design that we want this secret to be visible at first, but what we want to simulate with JavaScript is as if we hid all of the secrets as soon as the page loads. So we actually just wrote one line of JavaScript afterwards that triggers clicking all of them at once. So you can imagine a selector that would select all of the toggle buttons because we wrote it above. Let me make this bigger. We actually wrote it up here on line 18. We're going to select all the toggle buttons, and we decided, you know what, let's just pretend that someone went through and clicked them all at once. So you'll see that the page already refreshed, and when this page loads, it went through and it pretended to click on each one of these hide boxes from the beginning. So that answers the goal of hiding the secret when the page loads, making the secret visible when you click on the toggle, and flipping the chevron when you click the toggle. This all works great in CodePen, but depending on how fast someone downloads your web page, the content might not be on the page, the DOM might not finish rendering when it loads your JavaScript code. So what you're going to see in the final version of the file in Atom is a little bit of extra JavaScript that wraps everything that we already wrote. So right here is everything that we wrote today, but we wrapped it around a whole nother function that we defined that says on the document when it's ready, execute this code. So let me go back to CodePen, and I'm going to write that in here because it won't really affect the CodePen example. It's best practice to wrap all of your JavaScript into something that waits for the document object model to be loaded. And when a browser is done loading and rendering the HTML, it will fire an event called ready. So what we're going to do is select the document, and you can do that by passing document to the jQuery selector. And we're going to say when it's ready, run a function. What function are we going to run? Well, we're going to take all the code that we already wrote, and we're going to stuff it inside here. Don't forget the semicolon at the end. It actually looks like I forgot to indent all of this. So it makes it a little bit harder to read, but it makes sure that we wait until the document has been fully loaded before we try to find the buttons, before we try to find the icons, before we try to hide the secrets. And that is actually needed for your HTML file version to work. I didn't see that that was needed for the CodePen, but I wanted to show you how to write that anyways. So how can you apply this to your final project? Well, think about what we're doing here. We are finding elements in the document object model. We are changing their visibility with toggle. Imagine a lot of things that you can have happen on a web page when you click a button. You could have a button show a video. You could have a button show a map. Besides that, we are changing classes, and this is actually how a lot of animations happen on the web. You can define different CSS animations and transitions and attach them to a class. So with a little bit of JavaScript, you can go between phases of an animation by changing one class and replacing it with another. Now, I just showed you toggle class. If you go to the jQuery page that talks about toggle class, you'll see other examples that use add class and remove class. You could have a button that adds a class to anything on the page. So let's say you had a class that made something tilted or flipped it around. You could actually add and remove those classes to any element on the page when a button is clicked. And that's the other thing that I want to point out, is that we are registering events to happen on click. We are then listening and we're triggering that event manually ourselves with the trigger button or the trigger function. We're able to actually call that click to pretend it happened. And you'll see that we even are listening for ready. So you've listened to like 2 different events. You have fired an event manually with JavaScript. You can mix and match a lot of these techniques to do some really cool stuff on your final project. So you can use hide boxes if you want, because they're pretty handy for showing optional information, or you could use this to do something entirely different. So I'm going to stop here. This is the final hide box example, and you can download the files from Moodle. I will link to this CodePen inside of Moodle as well. Do you have any questions about what we did here, or about the wireframes, or the final project? All right, no questions yet. Well, I appreciate you joining the live stream or watching the recording later. I promise you that jQuery course has a lot of other demonstrations inside of it. So if you want to see how to add or remove classes, there are examples of that inside of the course. They even will create new content with JavaScript too, which is something that you can do as well. So I am going to stop the live stream. I'll hang on in the Slack chat room a little bit longer if you want to ask some other questions. See you again soon.